bits about me. I'm Dan. I work for a campus ministry organization called the CCO. Uh, I'm I'm married. That's my wife, or Disney World. We enjoy soccer, and we have a dog and two cats. This, I should clarify, these slides are here because I've adapted this slide presentation from a workshop I gave at a student conference that was broader in its D&D discipleship scope. So anyway, uh, let's get talking about D&D. I grew up American Baptist, but I am currently Episcopalian. That's the tradition I find myself in. So um, I'll be talking some about liturgy. I don't know who here is familiar with liturgy as an idea. If anyone grew up Roman Catholic or
I
Lutheran
don't
or
know what that
anything
word
like.
is.
Okay, cool. So liturgy is I have a definition coming up. But the three things that will, just to define some terms, discipleship, I think we can appropriately understand as the intentional spiritual formation that seeks to be conformed to the likeness of Christ. Let me get back to my slides. It dropped me out of it. All right. Prop role playing. This is pretty familiar, right? Players create and portray characters in accordance with a rule set, most often under the facilitation of a game master, and these games are narrative based, and they can last 3 hours, 3 years, or 3 decades for some of my Gen X friends that have been playing since second edition. And then liturgy is the formative practices that shape our habits, imaginations, and desires, most notably in the context of worship. So a liturgy would be really like how a worship service is structured. So some churches have a formal liturgy, and I would argue, and Evan may argue back, but I would argue that all church services have a liturgical element to them. Like there's a way that the service is structured in a particular way that forms how we do worship. The reason I'm talking about liturgy will become very clear in a moment. I want to start with this idea that human beings are the only species that have histories or tell stories. We're storytelling creatures. So that's a bust of Herodotus, the Greek historian, there on one side, and then the book 1776, which is just we come to understand ourselves through stories as human beings. We tell stories about where we've come from. It's one thing that separates me from my dog. That my dog, most to my knowledge, does not interact with other dogs at the dog park and say, I live in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania. I like to do these things, and I was born in such and such place, and then was adopted, so on and so forth. But we do that, right? Like storytelling is what gives us a sense of meaning and identity. So the reason I say that, and I start there, is because for most of human history, storytelling was about active participation. So anthropologically, storytelling developed to tell a community something about themselves. So for instance, if you look in the Old Testament, there's always this repeated phrase throughout the Old Testament. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. So the Hebrews can never forget this part of their identity that is tied to their liberation and their exodus. And it is told not just to those who were actually slaves in Egypt in the book of Exodus, but it's told to subsequent generations. So here's something about being a people group that this story is important to you, is forming your identity. Does that make sense so far? This is for most of human history, this is how we've done stories. And even in the book of Acts, when the first martyr of the church, Stephen, is stoned to death, he goes through telling the story from Israel, culminating through Jesus. And he said, he uses the phrase "our ancestors." So he's extending that Hebrew story into this early church New Testament post resurrection of Christ context. I want to set the stage for that to say that since you could argue since the creation of the radio, but absolutely now in 2025, we treat stories as sort of a passive reception. We don't view ourselves as participating in them. Even when you had plays in, whether it was in ancient Greece or with Shakespeare, there was a degree of audience participation and there was an audience interaction. Like a narrator would come up and stand on stage and speak directly to the audience because they were involved in the story. But now, like, we talk about binging shows, right? I had neurovirus last week and I turned on Disney Plus and I just watched one show for like a season and a half while I was recovering, right? It was just this very like very passive thing. It was and I'm not ragging on binging. I'm a millennial. We invented binging by going to FYE and buying like DVD box sets and just watching them over and over and over again. Like I take responsibility personally for putting binging TV out into the culture. But we are at this point right now where we don't think about stories having an impact on us or shaping us. But I say storytelling at its best is about active participation, not passive reception. So the way this applies, and I should say we naturally do this. Am I going too fast? Are we like, should I slow the pace or are we all tracking? Cool. I would say this active participation in stories is something we just naturally do. Think about if you have little brothers or sisters or nieces or nephews, or if you work in a daycare or Sunday school situation. Like when you play with kids just naturally create stories together and they want you to be part of that story, right? Like my niece, when I go up to visit, like we'll walk down a hallway and say, Daniel, there's a spider there. And there's no spider, but I'm going to pick up the imaginary spider and then she's going to want me to pick up a dozen more over the next like hour and a half. But we as human beings, I think, have a default setting of we're telling stories and we want people to participate in those stories. In these stories, like I said, shape our imagination and inform us to some degree about who we are. I think D&D and tabletop role playing is unique when it comes to storytelling right now because it is something that to really get the most out of it, you have to actively participate. So you can listen to podcasts like Critical Role or Dimension 20 or the Adventure Zone or these other actual play shows. You can just take those in. And I enjoy those shows too. But listening to them is very different than sitting down at a table with either friends or going to your local game store and maybe playing with strangers or a con and playing with strangers and participating in a story together as a community. And those experiences are very different. You know, the actual play podcast, there's a certain degree of polish to them that comes with that if you've ever been with a group that's like, well, maybe we'll start our own D&D actual play podcast. And then you kind of get the rough cut and you're like, oh, this is not what I thought it was going to be. This does not sound as much fun as we were actually having because of the two different experiences. So, but yeah, so right in the opening to the player's handbook, not the 2024 player's handbook. I haven't used that rule set yet, but the other previous one. To play D&D and to play it well, you don't need to read all the rules, memorize every detail of the game, or master the fine art of rolling funny-looking dice. None of those things have any bearing on what's best about the game. What you need are two things. The first being friends with whom you can share the game. Playing games with your friends is a lot of fun, but D&D does something more than entertain. Playing D&D is an exercise in collaborative creation. You and your friends create epic stories filled with tension and memorable drama. You create silly in-jokes that make you laugh years later. The dice will be cruel to you, but you will soldier on. You collect creativity. Your collective creativity will build stories that you will tell again and again, and it'll become the absurd stuff of legend. So the active participation of storytelling of D&D is very intentional. It's the way it's been designed at least since 3rd edition, and maybe even 2nd edition, and it's certainly most prominent now in 5th edition. That the rule set caters in that direction. So I think the explosion in popularity of D&D has everything to do with this uniqueness to tabletop role-playing game that is different than going to the movies, and it's certainly different than watching something on Hulu or Netflix or Max. And I think it's a return to something that we just enjoy doing, which is storytelling together. These are just a couple headlines over the last, at this point, decade or more. It's just that D&D has been recognized. Like therapists have started to use D&D for middle schoolers in their guidance offices, and then they've also seen the ways that D&D has been used to help work with people that have social anxiety and things like that. So there's a clinical and there's and other helping professions have started to embrace sort of the therapeutic element of D&D, which is why I think it has a application for spiritual formation. And so so to go to the piece of liturgy, I said that like there's this participation of a story. James K. A. Smith is he's a Christian writer, and he writes that worship works as fiction does. Both worship and fiction traffic in story and target the imagination, and literature and poetry are about cultivating a sense of plausibility. I would add, I think tabletop role-playing is a very particular communicative imaginative act that adds that much more to this idea of what's plausible. So this right here is a liturgical calendar. I think, if you've, as an Episcopalian, my community follows this calendar in a very specific way. But for the most part, I think most church communities they observe Advent, they celebrate Christmas. Then there's that season of Lent leading up to Easter, and then there's at least a celebration of Easter and a celebration of Pentecost. And what that really is just it's this cyclical calendar of worship that really is about like ingraining the Christian story, or the story of Jesus and the story of God's people, into our memory. Like it's an identity forming thing, similar to like what you see, what I was talking about earlier, in that it's really it's a really kind of anti-modern or pre-modern kind of thing, that whereas it is not a passive story to receive. It is something that like you go to church, you worship and you're probably going to worship the worship's going to look a little bit different at Easter than it does at Christmas, if only down to what kind of songs you sing. And like I said, liturgically year is designed to imprint the story of Christ into our very being as an individual and as a community. So why am I talking about all this stuff? I think tabletop role-playing and liturgy don't shy away from adversity and suffering. I'm not going to go hard into like, hey, use this to unpack the trauma of your players. That's not at all where I'm going with it. But what I think we as human beings have a natural aversion to engaging things that hurt or things that feel uncomfortable. And I think that has only been, that is only a stronger inclination now as, and I think that's also why like the popularity of counseling and therapy services have exploded, because we want to go to places where we can process the stuff we're carrying, that's kind of a side bit. If you go, I want to go full screen, but if you look at like player backgrounds have built into them a certain degree of adversity. If you had a character whose background didn't have some struggle in it, or if you had a character whose character traits didn't create friction with the people around them, that character would be boring. I don't know if you ever played with somebody that like essentially is just like a character who has no character flaws, and maybe you look at their scores and you're kind of like, I don't know if you actually rolled for those or point bought those, because that character feels pretty stacked. That is not a enjoyable way to play, unless you're going to do a one shot where you're all going to play God level. Sometimes that's fun because then there's just some monsters that are fun to try your hand at. But in general, if you're going to play a long campaign, that's not necessarily an exciting way to go about that. It's most obvious that character flaws, checkered backstories, and adversity, whether that's from combat encounters or from character and NPC interactions, is what makes the game fun. It's what makes the story intriguing. Just an important disclaimer. I am not trying to imply that the reasons that we suffer is because it makes our life. What I'm saying is that the reason we find the gameplay interesting and fun is because it feels lived and it resonates with us. And I think to some degree we desire resolution in that. Likewise, like your church calendar has adversity and suffering in it. So if you just want to look at Holy Week, if you start at Palm Sunday, you go through something like Monday, you have Jesus' entry at Palm Sunday. You go to Monday, Thursday, where Jesus has his last meal before his death with his friends, and you have his betrayal, and then you have his very physical suffering on Good Friday, followed by the resurrection on Easter Sunday. Even within that week, you have this this strong experience and remembrance of this observance of this story that enters into deep suffering, and then the promise of a resolution of new life and healing after that. And I think so. Like the resurrection of Easter is the pivot towards hope. It's the promise of a hopeful resolution. So that's kind of the framework that I want to offer to say the reason that I think D&D is a powerful tool is because we're participating with our imaginations in a certain way, and we're opening ourselves up in a certain way. And then we therefore also have a responsibility about how are we going to steward that space with our players and what stories are we going to take them through. And I do think that, say, the Christian narrative or the movement of Christ's life, death, and the resurrection, what we would also sometimes it's also referred to as Jesus' cross-shaped life, as in it goes through the crucifixion or cruciform life, is that movement of life into death and a new direction, into resurrection, life into suffering, into hope, is a framework that I think is helpful to structure our games around. So practical takeaways. It's always good, I think, to start with ourselves, to think about like what goes into if I'm going to build a campaign, I'm drawing from the stuff that I've already read or watched or imbibed. So I think it's important to ask ourselves, what stories am I creating? Am I inviting others into, and how are they reflecting my imagination? So as like you're writing something, as you're writing a session or a campaign, start paying attention to, well, what things are creatively just coming out of me that I may not be aware of? And are these things that I want to be using to shape the imaginations of my players? And this may involve doing some homework on your own imaginative life beforehand. So I think a great question is, what do I fantasize about when my mind has nothing else to do? Like, what are the default things that are rolling around your imagination when you get home from school or work and you sit down in your favorite chair or your couch and you're just kind of like, you let your mind wander? I should clarify, I also have ADHD, so this may also just be my own inclination for daydreaming and forming this, but I think, yeah, so, well, I will say that I think,
like me too.
Yeah, neurodiversity, I think, is strongly represented in gaming communities. So, I think it's a fairly shared experience as far as like the question of what are we fantasizing about. And then similarly to what I was saying before, like ask yourself, what stories do I passively receive, and are there trends in what I read and watch and listen to that I should consider? And I'm not an advocate for. I have a pretty wide breadth of what I think is okay for like followers of Jesus to watch and read and things. Like I don't have I'm not puritanical about that, but I do think it's important to kind of think like, well, what things am I drawn to, and start asking ourselves like, why is that the case? And then also, is that stuff that I feel like I want to share with my players? And I also think we've all played D&D here before, and that's why we want to lead these games. You can also ask, like, when you play a tabletop role-playing game, you can ask yourself, so what kind of characters do I tend to create, and what things are bringing me joy when I play those characters? But also, are my characters sometimes doing things that when I think about it, I'm not comfortable that they do those things. I think Paul in one of his letters writes the phrase, I do not do the things I want to, and I do the very things I hate. Sometimes I find that the characters I play in D&D are really great representations of that sentiment from Paul. Like, you know, it can be, you know, I think it's mostly harmless. But it is something to go, okay, so what inside of me is enjoying, playing the rogue that happens to throw a torch into the shop as I leave and burn it down as I go. Like, it can be fun, it can be funny, but if you're doing that with 3 different characters, I may ask myself the question, why am I inclined to that? What is in me about that? Here's a real practical thing that's a little bit of a divergence. I don't know if you guys use a system to check in on how your players are doing. This is a really important thing because you go through a story together and momentum gets built up. You need a system that lets players know that allows players to let you know how they're doing. So you need a system in place for players to express their comfort level with the game content. Because just because we're equipping players to engage with suffering and adversity, like, by which I mean that I personally think the hope is that if we're helping our players do hard things in the game, it helps equip them to maybe handle more challenging things outside of the game, right? If like maybe the characters they're playing become to have traits that they aspire to. I'm a person that is very inclined to be afraid of things. So sometimes I go, okay, well, sometimes I think, well, I play a lot of characters that I want them to be particularly courageous. And when I'm in moments where I'm feeling particularly fearful, are there things that I was able to play out in a game scenario in a more fantastical, imaginative way that was more courageous? And can I take that experience as I'm encountering this more challenging thing that is stirring in me fear? That's just an example. But just because we're equipping players to engage equipping players to engage in suffering adversity outside of the game, that does not mean that we have the right to drag them narratively into places that touch their woundedness and their hurt. So you need to have, I believe, it is your responsibility as a DM to have a system that lets you know, how they're feeling. So I like the card system where every player gets a green card, a yellow card, and a red card. So that means that, like, sometimes you can have really fun character interactions that feel really heated. But if you don't have a system, you can't be entirely sure, like, okay, is this the character or is this the player? Is the player really pissed off at me or this other player? Or is this a character interaction? And like with the card system, it's like, well, the player can like hold up the green card and say, hey, I'm having a lot of fun right now. My character is feeling livid, but I'm in a good space. The yellow one can say like, hey, we're approaching a sensitive area for me. Can we like slow down? Can we not go so hard? Maybe we need to pause the game and talk about it. And like the red card is just that we got to stop play immediately and we need to like just talk about what's going on. Maybe not necessarily at length, but recognize that that a line is being crossed and we need to reset what's happening. I think that's that is a safe and person-centered, God-honoring way that recognizes the presence of Christ in each other, and that all human beings bear the image of God. That's the way that we honor that we're all coming with different stuff to the table that we don't always recognize the other person has. And there's the card system's my favorite because it's straightforward. There's other things that people do that you can research online. If you can find not toxic subreddits that offer some of these resources. And I think the other takeaway is going back to the life, death, resurrection sort of Holy Week model of a story. I think it's important for us if we're leaning towards discipleship. And if we're DMing for the sake of discipleship, we should facilitate and participate in stories that bring hope. And we need to help our players write stories that refuse to let suffering have the last word within the game. I don't know if you've heard of this thing called hope punk. This is kind of another framework. Punk being the idea of like there's like steampunk and cyberpunk and punk rock, and punk being this kind of like this like anti-establishment idea. Hope punk was created sometime post 2010, kind of as a response to like this kind of prevalence of dystopian, really bleak kind of ideas. So hope punk, this is the definition was coined by somebody on Tumblr, which is just a very like, I feel like just like I mean this in the best way. It's like the quintessential nerdy way to define a genre is for somebody to post it on Tumblr and have it like take over the internet. So hope punk says that genuinely and sincerely caring about something, anything requires bravery and strength. Hope punk isn't ever about submission or acceptance. It's about standing up and fighting for what you believe in. It's about standing up for other people. It's about demanding a better, kinder world and truly believing that we can get there if we care about each other as hard as we possibly can with every drop of power in our little heart. And I really like that idea of like, well, how are we telling stories that keep that kind of, if we just have each other, if we just have community, we can keep pressing forward, and the darkness will not win. And that's not to say like you make games that are light and easy. In fact, I think some great examples of books or movies all right here are also like look pretty bleak. I think Lord of the Rings is just a great hope punk idea or hope punk story, especially if you look at The Hobbit. I think specifically in the book, the more power that Sauron gets, the more darkness covers the land. So like Peter Jackson's movies don't quite reflect that, but when you read Lord of the Rings, by the time Sam and Frodo are practically to Mount Doom, the world it's like it's night all the time, and yet you have these small cozy hobbits that would rather be sipping tea and having their sixth meal by noon, instead are like persevering through the darkness. And there's a great line that I love in Lord of the Rings, that I think it is Merry or Pippin asks Gandalf, is there any hope? And Gandalf's line is as long as Frodo and Sam are alive, there's hope. And there's just like this continual thread that everything will be okay. And there's other, please take notes of that or a screenshot or a picture, but there's other resources there, that if you want a good sense of what are some hope punk stories that, in the interest of what narratives do you want to receive and take in that might shape your imagination. I think these are some good suggestions. And they kind of run the gambit. The Good Places up there, Parks and Rec is up there. There's some anime up there.
I love all of this list. Watership Down is one of my favorite books. And I just finished The Martian recently, too.
Oh, awesome. So Watership Down, I just read last fall for the first time, and I loved it.
It's an amazing book. I have the graphic novel, too. It's beautiful.
Oof, that sounds... Now I'm trying to... I've seen the graphic novel copy, and I've wondered about that. So anyway, I'll just come in for a landing here. I think to keep in mind is Andrew Root is a practical theologian, and he says, when I hear your story, I share in your person. He's talking about that in sort of how do we share our life together. I think that has impact to some degree about what stuff are people implicitly bringing to our gaming table that we're sharing it, and that even if a person is not telling us all about themselves, parts of themselves are coming through in their character, and we are sharing in their person just by playing the game with them. And two other quotes. I'll just use the C.S. Lewis one because I really love it. Since it is so likely that children will meet cruel enemies, let them at least have heard of brave knights and heroic courage. Otherwise, you are making their destiny not brighter, but darker. And two links that related to Hope Punk. If after this session you have other questions for me about stuff, you can email me at either the email that was on the one that Evan sent out, or this is my personal email, to a now defunct blog that I used to have called the Pilgrim Geek. But the Pilgrim Geek blog at Gmail is a good email that I will respond to this kind of stuff at. So anyway, okay, I went a little bit over 20 minutes, so I apologize. There's my bibliography. But yeah, so I'll stop sharing my screen. Does everybody got the information they want for these two slides, or I can also like email the links and stuff. But
good go, mind.
Do you think that you might be able to send this PowerPoint to us as well?
Yeah, I can put like a view only link to the Google Drive that it's in,
Mm-hmm.
so you can check it out. Yeah. So okay, I apologize for going a little bit longer than I thought, but yeah. So let's jump into some questions, some conversation. My hope was, like I said, to give you sort of a framework. I understand there's a lot of like really nitty gritty practical stuff about like, well, what are we going to do in game? My presentation doesn't necessarily include that because all the game stuff is different, right? Interactions are different. How people DM is different. Are you sandboxing? Are you going to try to like railroad a narrative through? Some people enjoy that too. So anyway, yeah. I'm going to shut up. Please, throw some stuff out there. Let's chat.
I had a question for you. Did you homebrew your games, or do you use any of the books or templates?
So it depends. So with beginners, I'll say with beginners of a certain age, I would at least one shot with a template. So what I did actually not even younger, they were in their this group was in their 20s and 30s.
Mm-hmm.
And they never played D&D before. I did one session that was like from the starter set of 5th edition, help get everyone acclimated to how the game worked, and then I did a homebrew. I think my homebrew was really rough, and it had a lot of plot holes, but the good news is most of your players don't, like, if you put hours into building deep lore, your players don't notice or care. So in my case, it worked out. They weren't like, that didn't make sense. I don't know why that person survived. Anyway, but yeah, so I do homebrew because I like the storytelling aspect.
Mm-hmm.
My current DM, I'm now a player in a game, and that DM is going through, we just finished up a source book or a series of modules in a book, and that was also fun. Like, I think it has a lot to do with how much time and effort you want to put into that creative process.
Mm-hmm.
I think modules are great because they're a great springboard. Because the nature of the game, for it to be fun, it has to have some improvisation into it.
Yeah.
I also haven't homebrewed it. So anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, you're good. I have two questions. The first is, how do you tend to handle religious systems in D&D, different deities, that sort of thing?
Oh yeah.
As a Christian.
Absolutely. So this is actually a really common question I've gotten, and I think I like to point out that in I think Lord of the Rings is a good metric in this, in that just side note, Gary Gygax didn't like Lord of the Rings when he created D&D. He was more of a Conan the Barbarian guy. He did not like D&D, did not like that association and stuff. That's just a fun fact. I don't know why I mentioned it. Oh, because it's order of 8 and I've got ADHD. That's why. But I was going to say that I think Lord of the Rings is a great all the mythos of Middle Earth is a great point of reference, because there is no Judeo-Christian God in Middle Earth.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's a cosmology, there's divinity, there's deities, there's there's these kind of like angelic beings and things like that. But Tolkien very explicitly set out to create a uniquely non-Christian English mythology, was like his explicit goal. Tolkien was also a devout Roman Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
And that his like Roman Catholicism, his life as a Roman Catholic really just seeps through that creation. So that's why those themes are there, is they just organically come through.
Mm-hmm.
But there's nothing in Lord of the Rings that's explicitly Christian. So the reason I say all that is that I think like religious systems in a game, it's fiction. Like, I think the idea that there's no uh, I think an important part of religious observance um, is ritual, like what cultic activity. So like you go to
Mhm.
church, you as a group, you pray together, you take communion together. There's a baptism. Like there's a set of like religious or cultic practices. Cultic meaning like the life of the temple. Um, and playing in the context of D&D like that um unless you're going to have there's not really there's not it's not you wouldn't be playing a fun game if every week you got together to play D&D and it was like, well, everyone's going to all the characters every week go and sacrifice something to TM at the
Yeah.
dragon.
Mhm.
And that's like at that point you'd be in a gray area, but that's just not a fun game. So I think
Mhm.
it's safe to say, well, this is fiction. um and certainly like Tolkien didn't have any qualms creating a whole cosmology of divine beings. Um,
Sure.
I think there is some nuance there about like what to go back to like what are we leading characters through, or
Mhm.
what's coming out of ourselves in characters, like how if there are trends in how our characters go about religious observance. Like if someone's always playing a cleric and their cleric is always perhaps following a deity that's more malevolent and perhaps
Mhm.
living into that, then you can get into alignment and all those questions. But like generally, like I think it's a pretty um it's less about the short answer that I should have said at the outside. I think it's less about it's less about the content and more about how is it being played.
Mhm.
Does that make sense? So
Yeah, that
I
makes
can't think
sense.
of yeah, I can't think of anything that's exclude what the con there's nothing in the content that I think is that that is worth excluding or should be excluded.
Mhm.
But there is but the question then is also like, well, but what are we doing with that content? How are we stewarding that content for
Mhm.
our players?
Got it. The other question that I had was, what are some of the most significant differences you see DMing between different age groups? I have,
Mm-hmm.
at this point in my life, exclusively DM'd for adults. So if you're DMing a campaign for children or teenagers, my little brother who's 13 has expressed interest in
Yeah,
playing D&D. Like, what does that look like? Because I certainly wouldn't throw him into some of the campaigns that I've played with all of my adult friends.
yeah,
But
yeah,
I know that that is feasible. So what does that look like for you?
yeah. First time adult D&D players, I think tend to start a little stiff if they've never played before. You kind of get them warmed up to how the whole like playing pretend as an adult with a rule set works. Um, I'll say your average middle schooler jumps right in, and you just got to be prepared to let it be wacky. Um, I think like the improv theater idea of yes and is a great principle. I ran a one shot around Thanksgiving for a friend for my friend's daughter. Um, and I had a mashed potato goal and it was all Thanksgiving themed. But there's a point in there where I expected to be combat heavy. And especially what my friend's daughter wanted to do was like save the children that were at the party and usher them away from combat. And like you just don't count on that. So I think to just be open to some different degrees of creativity. I think different generations engage with violence differently. Different kids engage with violence differently. So like, you just gotta be ready to kind of like roll with those punches. No pun intended. As far as like, well, what if I'm preparing for something that's combat heavy, but this like, if you've got a group of kids that aren't going to be combat heavy and they're going to be more creative about it, how do you accommodate and let it be fun? Because that's the most important thing. Is like, how's it fun and how are we having a good time? And it's not. I'm a big believer that the most important thing is not that the DM gets to tell their story to everybody else playing, right? So does that help? Does that?
Yeah, that does. Thank you. That's good.
Yep.
One of my friends and I had a conversation. She's actually a dungeon master as well. And I was discussing combat with her and how I didn't want like if I'm playing a game with kids, I don't want it to be too bloody and too gory, and I don't want it to go too much. And she said use Sonic rules. So
Yeah.
where like if you're playing a Sonic video game, if you defeat any of the any of the creatures, they turn into like a butterfly or a bird, and they revert back to what they were before, so that there's really no death, but they're still able to do the combat part of it. Do you think that's a good way to handle that, or do you think I should do something different?
I think it's a perfectly fine way to handle that. Like, I also think that I'm also not opposed to there being death within D&D. I also think, I mean, the D&D rule set also says like that, like, there's a particular point where like dead happens. Like, if you hit 0 hit points, they're unconscious, and then you've got to do the death saving throws. So even within the game system, like, you could also just say, well, they're unconscious, they're not dead now. Like, but I think if you're concerned about the violence piece or or particularly the death piece, that's a great way to do it. I also like to think of it like what's I think Sonic rules is a great idea. I think something like the faceless armies that you see in so many Marvel movies, or like the battle droids in the Star Wars kind of idea. Like, you can also do faceless enemies that are fun to knock over too. But also, I also think that I think sometimes we also think that kids don't know what death is, and that doesn't mean that we just make death everywhere. There has to be an intentionality to it. But I also sometimes think that we should feel comfortable with wisdom, letting mortality kind of be part of the game. That's not an obligation, though. Of course, if a person if you don't feel comfortable with that or feel ready to do that, that's also like, don't take your players places you don't want to go, and also don't go there yourself.
Yeah, I'm basically curious, like, extending that, because I think that's our biggest, like, because the people we're going to be playing with specifically, like me, Kira, Casey, and then Kyle and Jonathan, if whatever it is, but it's middle schoolers and high schoolers, and some of them have played, some of them have not, and basically we're trying to figure out, like, where is the balance between reality, so they experience death and suffering and hard things in real life, and so this is like a way to process it and communicate with each other and experience it together or whatever it is, and also not just like, so like my 2 boys who are younger than them, they play with Kyle actually and his niece, and sometimes there's just absolute chaotic violence just for the sake of being violent, because they don't get to do that in real life, and so I think they want to like play it, which I totally understand that. And so I'm trying to like figure out, granted that's in one of our own homes, so rather than a church basement, so there's like a little bit of a difference there. It's with our own kids as opposed to like other people's kids. So there's a little difference there. So like, where is the balance between like not just being violent for the sake of being violent, but also like realistic a little bit with figuring out suffering together, I guess.
Yeah, well, and the idea of like, well, how much do you want to emphasize the suffering with like a group of 13-year-olds is like when I play with my peers, I feel pretty okay with like asking another player, hey, you're going to defeat this enemy, how do you want to do it? And if they give me an incredibly like squishy, violent description, like that's one thing. I think the idea of like, I have not watched, because I am not a parent, and it would be inappropriate for me to observe kids too closely, especially if I didn't know them. I don't know how most kids today play. When I was a kid, like our playing on the playground was heavily unregulated. Granted, it was the mid '90s, so I don't know how things have changed. But that's all to say that like we could sword fight with sticks and really do some bruises to each other. But that's all to say that I think there is a degree where I think that you can this is one of those areas where I don't know if I'm giving perfect advice or not, but there may be something to like, if D&D is designed for combat. There's other tabletop role playing games that aren't combat, that don't depend on combat, but you really have to stretch D&D to have a non-combat campaign. You can do it, but it's hard. Like, it's just the way the whole thing is designed, is that So, but that's all to say that I think that because you're probably going to have combat encounters, and the kids are going to want to have combat encounters, right? That's going to be part of the fun to some degree. But I think you may also be able to sort of like let them sort of set the tone for what that violence looks like within the context of that combat, because it's all theater of the mind, right? Like you're rolling dice. It's like, I hit him with my sword. Okay, cool. But if like, then like you might find a kid that's like, oh, well, like I stab him in the eye. And you're like, okay. Like you kind of like let kids, because kids play together, right? And they bring different degrees with things together. I also think that's why the card system is an important idea, is to teach the kids the card system. So if you've got one kid who maybe has watched a lot of R-rated movies with their older brother, or something like that, or a parent or something, like if you've ever had like a small group where a 12-year-old has seen Texas Chainsaw Massacre, boy, that can throw off a discussion. But like to be able to like let the kids kind of set the degree to set what the theater of the mind violence looks like, and also have the other stuff there. So if a kid goes, this is feeling like it's too much, this is making me squeamish, I don't like I think you can kind of also use that as maybe the opportunity to say, like, here's how we respect each other's boundaries in this space. So I think there's a lot that can be taught through just the community of people being together in this way.
And if I may, and maybe less of a question, more of a sort of, we'll call it an observation or question for the group on how to handle things. So as Allie mentioned, I've TM'd I think 3 or 4 times now for her kids and some of the other kids, which age range is what are we at, like
8 to 12.
8 to 12, yeah. So one thing that my adult friends and I have always had was a very unspoken kind of agreement that, hey, we're the heroes, we're going to just kind of follow along the story, kind of go with the beat and save the day or whatever it might be. And one of the things that I've realized, and I tested this past weekend, is that kids are told what to do every day, essentially. Yep. So when you give them the chance to do what they want, oftentimes they want to be a little bad. They want to steal from their neighbors, burn down the tavern, kill a bunch of things. And so I think I'm only bringing that up because I was expecting more so to be like, all right, guys, here's the thing, follow the plan, you're going to be the heroes. And then my niece is like, I'm evil. I was like, that's different. So it almost feels more of like to me, it was more of like hey, I maybe need to change my own like approach to things to see what they're all doing. Because I don't think everybody's going to be the same. Yeah.
Sure. If I could speak to that briefly, I've played with college students who are exactly like that too. So like not middle schoolers, but one thing that I think is helpful is to provide like more realistic story consequences for wanton violence. So, if you're in a cave and you're just slaying monsters or whatever, that's fine. But if you go to a village and you just murder somebody, have police officers who are stronger than the player characters and like throw them in a dungeon and like have some consequence for that and like play that out, because I think part of it's the power fantasy, right? Like, oh, I'm stronger than everybody, but if you like introduce the idea of some threat, like, oh, my characters could actually get in trouble or die if I do stuff like this, sometimes I think that can maybe keep people a little bit on track. The other thing that I started doing since running that one campaign was to just at the beginning during character creation say, you guys are free to play whatever kind of character you want, but remember you are a team. So play a character that can function on a team. If you want to play a character that cannot function on a team, maybe that's like a good character to save for a different context and play someone who can at least work with the party, right? And you guys can decide what your goals are together. But those are just 2 thoughts.
Yeah.
Have you guys ever played games where the DM has said you cannot use the evil alignment?
Yeah, I've done that sometimes.
Yeah, I've had games like that as well.
Evil. I've only let people do it in like really select circumstances if I know them super well and I know that they're not going to like mess up,
go out of control
too much. Get out of control if it's more controlled.
Yeah, more so because yeah, it's similar to what Jonathan said. If you know that their intention is to still be that evil character, like my nieces, but be a team player, um, however that may look, I find that gives them not only what they kind of want out of the game, but also it adds a bit of spice to it in a way.
A little bit of, yeah,
Pizzazz.
little
It's just
pizzazz.
it's a little bit trickier to work with though, because you do have to mix things up and keep everybody kind of together, despite that being not easy all the time.
Yeah.
I think there's a balance too between like there's like I think a lot of kids I think feel if only like on a physical size level, don't feel like they have a lot of power, right? They're kind of like if you're the small kid on the playground, which wasn't me, but but if you're the small kid on the playground, like you don't feel like you can feel relatively powerless. So D&D is also like this is a great space feel to feel powerful. But then there's that balance with like how does that power fantasy affect the gameplay for everybody? I think I like the consequences idea too. Like, oh, if they burn down an item shop, the kids aren't gonna know. Adult players don't know if you like make something up that wasn't in your notes, and you're like, oh, by the way, that item you wanted, turns out the map was in the item shop you burned down. I don't know what we're gonna do now, guys. We gotta figure out. You can kind of do those things so like they still get the fun of the chaos, but also I think like the consequences is a great idea because that's also like that's a little bit real life, right? Like, which is
a bit
and also it goes back to the making stuff interesting.
You just want to try really hard to make it not feel like a punishment. Like I tried very hard in that scenario to like not make my players feel like I was punishing them for being bad. It's just, oh, you actually at level 3 aren't strong enough to fight off an entire village. Who would have guessed? These are the natural repercussions of your actions. So trying to like, keep it more on that level instead of a slap on the wrist.
Right. And that comes, I think, also with like tone also. So like it's one thing to say like, oh, well, the map was in the place you burned down to be like to have like a character be like, well, I believe the shopkeeper has, and then they all go, oh, bummer. Like that's just like there's I think D&D exists like it's a game. It's there to be fun, right? Like and like the rule of cool and like how do we make sure everybody's having that time a good time in a particular direction. I'm more than willing to take more questions or continue this discussion. It is also after 8, and I want to be respectful of your guys' time.
Do you have any beginner like book games that you could recommend, like as a good one shot
for D&D?
I've never actually played a book game.
Yeah, I think, I mean the Minds of Fandelver from the starter set is real easy. Takes them up through level 5. It's like really smooth. It all takes place out of a village and into a mine and a couple surrounding areas, but it's like it's not a grand epic. It's kind of like I'm trying to find analogies that fit that don't like line up from 2000 when I played a lot more video games. But it's kind of like the demo. It's like here's your village that you started kind of thing. And I think so something like that's good. I think really any what you would call like any tier 1 module or series of modules, so that's levels 1 through 5, tend to be pretty good introductory things. But especially Minds of Fandelver from the starter set is designed as being an onboarding kind of game. And you can also like there's also a lot of free resources too. There's a lot of really great like the D20 system is now more or less kind of open source. So you can Google like intro campaigns and for new players and find like free PDFs and stuff too.
Here, I have the Lost Minds of Fandelver module he was talking about if you want to borrow it. I haven't used it in a while, but I've played through it like 3 times. It's great.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Amazing. I'll say if anybody has more questions for Dan, he can you can just email them to him, maybe, since it is 8:06. Thank you so much. This was so helpful. I have never played D&D. My husband plays, my kids play. I obviously know many people who play, and I am the one who just decided I wanted our youth group to do it. And I was like, but I need someone who knows what they're doing because I do not.
Mm-hmm.
So I have recruited people, obviously. So I super appreciate all this input. I love the card system. I'm 100% going to laminate red and yellow and green cards. Because I think we have a big range of what people are going to be comfortable with. So I think it's going to be very helpful. Amazing. Thank you so much. I know Evan texted me. He is on bedtime duty tonight. So he is obviously out, but I think that's why he recorded it. So I don't know, Dan, if you will get the recording because you're the host.
Yeah, I think I'll download it and I'll put it to Google Drive with a link.
That would be amazing.
I can shoot the link to Evan or to you, and I'll just put it back on the thread. So
amazing. That along with just a viewable version of your whole slide would be excellent, because I'm definitely going to want to go back through that for a few things. But thank you so much. Thank you guys for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Dan.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.
This was interesting. Thank you so much, Dan.
Thank you. This is a lot of fun for me. I really appreciate it. And don't hesitate to email me questions for resources or other kind of thoughts.
Definitely
I can talk about D&D and gaming all night. So.
Perfect.
Thank
you. Thank you so much.
Nice meeting you, Dan. Thank you.
Nice meeting you.
Nice meeting you.
Good night.
Yeah, good luck with your leading your game.
Thank
you. Bye.